Okay, let's craft and pack this. The world of global trade policy, it just got, well, a lot more interesting. And maybe a bit unpredictable.
Definitely unpredictable seems like the right word.
Right. So, Monday, July 7th, 2025, President Trump starts sending out these letters. 14 countries get them first, announcing significant new tariffs on their exports to the U.S.
And they're set to kick in quite soon, August 1st.
Exactly. So today, that's what we're diving into. These new tariff rates, where they came from, and this whole unfolding global trade landscape.
What's truly fascinating here, I think, isn't just the numbers themselves, the percentages, it's the ripple effects, right? The potential impact these decisions could have on consumers, on economies globally.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, we've been sifting through recent articles, official statements, looking at sources like NPR, NBC News, Time, CNBC, trying to pull out the most crucial takeaways for you.
Yeah, to distill it down.
Our mission really is to cut through all the noise and get you up to speed on this complex tariff roller coaster, as we're calling it.
We want to give you that shortcut to being well-informed, what these tariffs mean for you, for global trade, and yeah, for the countries involved.
Okay, so let's jump right into the latest announcement. These new tariffs are going live August 1st.
President Trump signed them, posted the letters to social media on July 7th, informing those first 14 countries of their new rates.
And the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, she confirmed more letters are on the way too. So this list isn't even final.
Right. And the main reason given in those letters, which were apparently nearly identical, President Trump cited a significant trade deficit. And he said the relationship has been, quote, far from reciprocal. That seems to be the core justification presented.
It's interesting you bring up the deficit right away because some of the sources we looked at, especially the economic analyses, they actually call that a, well, simplistic measure.
Right. That's a common critique from mainstream economists.
But before we get too deep into the why, let's just look at who got these letters first. It's a real mix of rates for these initial 14.
It really is. You've got Bangladesh facing 35%.
Then Bosnia and Herzegovina at 30%. And there was that odd detail the sources picked up on.
Oh, right. The initial letter addressed the female leader as Mr. President.
Yeah, corrected later to Madam President. Just a curious side note. But what's also notable is some rates changed from earlier proposals.
That's true. Cambodia, for instance, is now set for 36%. That's actually down from the 49% rate floated back on April 2nd.
Okay, so a reduction there.
But then on the flip side, Japan is at 25%, which is a slight increase from its initial 24% back in April.
Interest.
And the rest of that first list, Indonesia 32%, Kazakhstan 25%, Laos a pretty high 40%, Malaysia 25%, also a tiny increase from 24%. Myanmar also at 40%.
Okay.
Then Serbia at 35%, South Africa 30%, that's a small reduction from 31%. South Korea 25%, a slight reduction from 26%.
Right.
And Thailand at 36%, Tunisia at 25%.
So a real mixed bag of adjustments and levels.
Definitely. And it's really important to clarify something here. These new tariffs, they aren't imposed on top of existing broader tariffs.
Okay, good point. Like the steel and aluminum ones.
Exactly. That standing 50% tariff on steel and aluminum worldwide, that remains separate. Those duties are still in effect, but they're not, layered onto these new country-specific rates. It's not additive in that way.
Got it. So we've got the new rates, the first group of countries.
Yeah.
But, the really crucial question, the one that often gets mixed up, is who actually pays for these tariffs?
Yeah, this is fundamental. There's this common idea, maybe pushed sometimes, that the other countries pay the tariff.
Right, that China or Japan writes a check to the U.S. Treasury.
But that's not how it works. The sources are very clear. Tariffs are taxes. And they're paid to the U.S. government by companies in the U.S. that are importing the goods or components.
Okay. Paid by American companies.
Yes. And this is critical because it directly connects to you, the listener, as a result of U.S. companies paying these taxes. Well, what usually happens?
The cost gets passed on.
Often, yes. Passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. That's the most direct impact many people feel.
And President Trump seems aware of ways companies might try to get around this.
Definitely. The letters specifically warn about transshipment.
Explain that again.
So that's where goods are maybe made in, say, China, but then they're shipped through one of these 14 countries, maybe relabeled, to try and avoid a higher Chinese tariff rate. and get the lower rate of the intermediate country.
Ah, okay. Like routing it through Vietnam to avoid a China tariff.
Exactly. Trump's warning is that those transshipped goods will be subject to that higher original tariff anyway. They're trying to prevent that kind of evasion. And apparently, Chinese state media has already warned its companies against doing this.
And there's a stick, too, right? A threat in the letter.
Well, yeah, a very clear one. If any of these countries impose a reciprocal tariff on U.S. goods,
Like hitting back.
right, the letter states, quote, whatever the number you choose to raise them by will be added onto the U.S. tariff that we charge.
So automatic escalation, tit for tat, built right in.
Pretty much. But there's also a carrot, an incentive offer.
What's-
Companies from these countries could potentially avoid the new tariffs if they choose to manufacture their goods in the U.S. instead. Bring the production here.
Okay, so trying to encourage domestic manufacturing as an alternative.
That seems to be the angle. But these domestic facts, these immediate policies, they don't just happen in a bubble. They're part of this bigger, kind of chaotic picture.
The tariff roller coaster, as we called it.
Exactly. To really get why things feel so volatile now, you kind of have to look back a bit.
Trace it back, and these new tariffs, they really stem from that April 2nd, 2025 executive order, don't they?
They do. That's when Trump initially imposed tariffs on almost every country worldwide, an event he called Liberation Day.
Liberation Day. Quite a name. But that didn't last long in its original form.
No, not at all. What really stands out from the sources is the reaction. Stock markets plunged.
I remember that.
Yeah, and economists warned about some pretty dire consequences. So just a week later, April 9th, Trump announced a pause.
Okay, a pause. What did that mean?
It meant lowering the tariffs dramatically, down to 10%, but only for 90 days. The stated plan was to then jump right back up to those high Liberation Day levels on July 9th.
But that didn't happen either.
Nope. Another twist. On July 7th, the same day these new letters went out, another executive order officially pushed that July 9th deadline back again, this time to August 1st.
Citing additional information and recommendations. Okay, so the deadline keeps shifting.
It does. And remember, back in the spring, there was that promise Trump made. 90 deals in 90 days before the original July 9th deadline.
Vaguely, yeah. How did that pan out?
Well, the reality was quite different. By that original deadline, only 2 actual deals were announced. One with the UK in early June and another with Vietnam right before the deadline on July 2nd.
Just 2 out of 90.
Plus a preliminary agreement with China in June. But yeah, far short of 90. Officials later sort of lowered expectations, aiming for maybe 12 deals.
And blamed other countries.
Yeah, trade advisor Peter Navarro was quoted blaming other countries for dragging their heels.
Okay, let's look at that Vietnam deal as an example. What did that involve?
So for Vietnamese exports coming into the U.S., the tariff was set at 20%. Now that's way down from the 46% originally threatened back in April.
Okay, better than 46%.
For sure. But it's still much, much higher than the pre-Trump average tariff on Vietnamese goods, which was around 3%.
Right, so a big jump from the historical norm.
Definitely. And for goods deemed transshipped through Vietnam, a 40% tariff. Meanwhile, Vietnam agreed to impose no tariffs on U.S. imports.
So what's the bottom line for people here?
Well, it means the cost for U.S. consumers of goods from Vietnam, and that includes a lot of stuff, machinery, appliances, clothes, shoes, and those costs may soon be markedly more expensive.
Right. And this all fits into Trump's overall approach, doesn't it? Favoring these one-on-one deals.
Exactly. Bilateral deals, country by country, instead of those big multilateral agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP.
Which he pulled the U.S. out of back in 2017.
Correct. He prefers negotiating directly. And some experts, like Scott Lincecum from the Cato Institute, argue that if the U.S. had stayed in the TPP, trade restrictions with Vietnam, for example, would actually be very, very low right now.
Interesting perspective. It highlights that choice between bilateral and multilateral strategies.
And it connects back to his focus on those bilateral trade deficits as the main scorecard for whether a trade relationship is fair.
Right. The idea that if the U.S. imports more from a country than it exports to them, that's inherently bad or unfair.
That's his metric. But as we touched on, many mainstream economists really push back on that.
They call it simplistic.
Yeah, they argue it's a poor measure, that for a large, advanced economy like the U.S., importing goods that are made more cost-effectively elsewhere is normal, even beneficial. And deficits often reflect bigger things, like domestic savings rates or investment flows, not just trade policy fairness.
So a fundamental disagreement there on how to even measure success in trade.
A very fundamental one. And these domestic debates, these policy choices, They're obviously causing ripples globally. We're seeing some really fascinating reactions and negotiations playing out.
Yeah, let's get into that, because the messaging around the deadline itself seems flexible.
Very much so. Trump posted on Truth Social on July 8th saying no extensions to the August 1st deadline. Sounded firm.
Okay.
But then, just hours later, he posted again clarifying, "We can do things over the years too. We're not hardline." He also noted, "The deals are mostly my deal to them. We're picking a number that's low."
Firm, but not 100% firm, as the outline put it.
Kind of feels that way. And the letters themselves, remember, they said tariffs may be modified upward or downward depending on our relationship with your country. So there's wiggle room built in.
And the markets reacted to this back and forth.
They did. Stocks apparently fell meaningfully into the red right after that first no extensions post on July 8th.
Okay.
But then they recovered later. It just highlights the volatility created by this uncertainty.
And what about the countries themselves? Are the smaller ones getting sidelined?
It seems that way, according to some experts cited in the sources. Smaller trading partners, who are often the hardest hit by these kinds of shifts, were largely sidelined in negotiations. They likely just received the letters without much prior discussion.
Just a notification, basically.
Pretty much. And even for the major trading partners, experts noted that achieving quick, concrete deals might be tough. The current agreements seem more like broad frameworks rather than fully finalized deals.
Okay, let's look at some specifics. Japan. How are they reacting?
Well, Japan's Prime Minister, Shigeru Ishiba, called the higher 25% tariff extremely regrettable. He says they'll keep working towards a deal.
But Trump sounds skeptical about Japan.
Publicly, yes. He's accused Japan of being very tough, even very spoiled. He specifically mentioned rice, saying they won't take our rice even though Japan has a massive rice shortage.
Is that accurate about the rice?
Well, the sources clarify that Japan does actually import tariff-free rice, and a lot of it comes from the U.S., so that claim seems questionable.
Anything else on Japan?
He also complained about cars, saying essentially, we give Japan no cars, they won't take our cars, and yet we take millions and millions of their cars. It's not fair. That imbalance is clearly a focus for him.
Okay. What about South Korea?
South Korea requested an extension. They seem to view the letter itself as a sort of de facto extension, buying them time until August 1st.
And their president.
President Lee Jae-myung made a revealing comment. It's still not clear to each side what the other side wants. Suggests some confusion in the negotiations.
Interesting. And they dispute Trump's claims about their tariffs.
Strongly. South Korea says their tariffs on U.S. goods are effectively close to zero, like 0.79% because of their existing free trade agreement. That directly contradicts Trump's claim that South Korea imposes tariffs 4 times higher than the U.S. does on them.
Another point of contention.
Yeah, and Trump has also brought up the cost of U.S. military aid to South Korea in these trade discussions, linking security and trade.
Okay. How about our neighbors? Canada.
Canada was hoping to get a deal done by July 21st. Talks resumed after Canada backed down on a proposed digital services tax.
A tax Trump didn't like.
He called it a direct and blatant attack. After Canada dropped it, the White House apparently described Canada as having caved. So some friction there, but talks are ongoing.
And the European Union. Always a big trading partner.
The EU was aiming for an agreement in principle by the deadline. But there are roadblocks. Things like the EU's stricter regulations on social media and tech companies seem to be sticking points.
And are they threatening retaliation?
Germany's finance minister, Lars Klingbeil, issued a warning. He said the EU will have to take countermeasures if a fair deal doesn't happen. So the potential for escalation is there too.
Okay. India. Any movement there?
Sources suggest there's a possibility of a very big interim deal with India. Maybe not a final comprehensive one, but something significant.
What are the sticking points?
The U.S. wants more market access for things like genetically modified crops, dairy, almonds, soybeans. India, on the other hand, is reluctant to lower protections for its domestic farmers. That's a sensitive issue there.
But some potential compromise areas.
Yes. India has apparently shown some willingness to lower tariffs on specific products. Walnuts, fruits, medical devices, cars, energy. So there might be room for a narrower deal.
And China. We mentioned a preliminary deal in June.
Right. That preliminary agreement set U.S. tariffs on Chinese imports at 55% and Chinese tariffs on U.S. imports at 10%.
Oh.
It also included some easing of restrictions and lifting of export controls. Still seems tentative, though.
And then there's this BRICS angle.
Yeah, that popped up more recently. On Sunday, Trump posted another warning on Truth Social
What did it say?
that countries aligning themselves with the anti-American policies of BRICS would face an additional 10% tariff on top of whatever else they're charged.
Wow. And BRICS includes?
Well, the core group includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. They recently held a summit and condemned tariffs. And Iran is also involved. Trump specifically mentioned Russia, China, and Iran in his post.
And some of the countries on the initial list of 14 are BRICS members.
That's right. Indonesia and South Africa are both members. So that threat adds another layer of pressure specifically on them.
Okay, so pulling all these threads together, what are the real-world consequences we're looking at the bottom line?
Well, first, as we discussed, the costs. They are real and will be paid upfront by U.S. companies.
Which likely means passed on to consumers, us.
Exactly. Wall Street analysts estimate these tariffs could add a bit to consumer inflation. Maybe not drastically, but measurably.
And the Yale Budget Lab had a stark comparison.
Yeah, they noted that these letters, if the tariffs stick, would hike the effective tariff rate on U.S. consumers. That's the average rate across all imports to the highest level it's been since 1934.
Since 1934, that's significant.
It really puts it in historical perspective. And the impact isn't just felt here.
Right, the smaller economies.
Exactly. The sources emphasize that the economies of smaller nations, the ones the U.S. often relies on for lower-cost goods, they stand to be devastated by these kinds of disruptions to trade flows.
Even if their trade deficit with the U.S. isn't huge.
Right. Myanmar was mentioned as an example, with a relatively small deficit of about $579 million. But for their economy, a sudden high tariff could be catastrophic.
And beyond the direct costs, there's the uncertainty itself.
Huge factor. ING analysts were quoted saying the ongoing uncertainty could do almost as much economic harm as actual tariffs. Businesses hate uncertainty. It makes planning, investment, really difficult.
And there's a legal cloud hanging over some of this, too.
A very important one. Remember those reciprocal tariffs Trump threatened, where the U.S. automatically matches any tariff imposed by another country?
Yeah, the tit-for-tat mechanism.
Well, that specific policy was actually struck down in late May by a federal district court.
Struck down? Why?
The court ruled that President Trump lacked the legal authority under existing U.S. law to impose tariffs that way, automatically.
So they're illegal.
According to that court, yes. However, the administration appealed the ruling. And while that appeal is under review, the tariffs are allowed to remain in effect.
Okay, so legally up in the air, but still happening for now.
Exactly. It just adds yet another layer of legal and economic uncertainty to this whole situation.
Okay, so we've really taken a deep dive here into this dynamic, fast-moving, and pretty impactful shift in U.S. trade policy.
Yeah, lots of swift announcements, sometimes contradictory messages, this complex web of negotiations, threats, potential retaliations. It's reshaping global trade in real time.
And circling back to the so what, for you, the listener, this isn't just abstract economics playing out on a world stage.
Not at all. It directly affects you, potentially through higher prices on all sorts of everyday goods, clothing, shoes, cars, electronics, appliances, the list goes on.
Mm-hmm. So understanding these moves, even with all the uncertainty, gives you vital context.
Yeah.
For the headlines you're seeing and, yeah, for your own wallet.
Absolutely.
So here's where it gets really interesting, maybe something to chew on. If that August 1st deadline is truly firm, but not 100% firm, as it seems, and deals are apparently still possible right up to the last minute, maybe even after, what does that signal about the future? Are we entering an era where major economic policy gets negotiated out loud, in public, often through social media, where this kind of high-stakes brinkmanship just becomes the norm for international trade?
That definitely raises a critical question. In a world where trade policy can be announced, then maybe tweaked or reevaluated within hours, sometimes based on a social media post, what does that do to stability, to predictability, for global supply chains, for consumer prices? And how are countries supposed to adapt to this kind of rapid-fire bilateral approach, especially when, as we just discussed, the legal ground for some of these policies is still being challenged? It's a lot to navigate.